Everybody, God bless you. Hey, listen, I'm just firing back a response to a friend that I'm talking to about Old Testament manuscripts with the Bible, contrasting the ones that we have in Hebrew versus the Greek ones. And so I thought, you know what? Let me just make a quick video on this. Maybe this will help some folks because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. King James tradition basically follows the William Tyndale Bible that preceded it. There were some translations in between the Tyndale Bible, which was the first English translation. The Catholic Church actually killed William Tyndale. He became a martyr, trying to get the Bible out to people so they can have it in their own language. Around that same time frame, which is in 1500s, the printing press was being created for the first time. So it was these two efforts that were converging to make the Bible in the hands of the people for the first time in history. So praise God for that. But real quick, let me just throw this out there. The King James Bible is based on Hebrew Masoretic text, okay? And so newer Bibles, they got little variations of which ones kind of go with the Greek, Septuagint, versus maybe some mixtures. Even the ESV, for instance, kind of will even in their whole critical text process where they're trying to converge on verse by verse which one we're going to use or whatever, they consider Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts as well, which are really old. So Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, just to tell you, are dated somewhere from as early, some of them are as early as 200 BC dated, to going as much as maybe 50 years AD. So somewhere between 200 to 50 AD, 200 BC to 50 AD. There's about, I think, somewhere around 1,000, if not a little more than 1,000 scrolls that were found in, I think, at least 8 different caves in Qumran, Israel, from 1948 to 1955. So anyway, so that's there, and there were some Septuagint copies found there too. So there's actual Septuagint copies of, let's say, for instance, Sirach, that's dated about 100 BC. So when people are making the claim the Septuagint was written later, I mean, there's sufficient Septuagint that predate Christ that show the story of it being in the 200s BC. I mean, it's so corroborated by so many. I won't get into that here. Jews and Christians in the first couple of centuries. Anyway, let me just read to you what I was sharing with my friend. I understood it. So anyway, this friend of mine was basically talking about Hebrew manuscripts, and since I've been studying New Testament Greek and also Old Testament Greek when you consider the Greek Septuagint, I've been studying that for, 4 or 5 years. He was making, as we were conversing in Greek over a little instant messenger thing, he was basically telling me, hey, it'd be good to learn Hebrew too, and that he had studied Hebrew and he'd studied Latin a little bit, and it's good so you can read the manuscripts. And so then I fired back this response. So let me just share this with you. What I was saying is the oldest Old Testament we have, complete Old Testament I should say, is the Septuagint, or symbolized the LXX, which is Roman numeral, stands for 70, because it's pointing to the 72 translators that, as the story of Ptolemy Philadelphus II, chartered and negotiated with Jerusalem to have them to come to Alexandria, Egypt, to translate the Hebrew into the Greek, Koine Greek. So anyway, let me continue. We have codices, or codex, which basically is a word from Latin that just means book. So that was the word that they use whenever they talk about these. Codex Vaticanus, which is about 300 AD dated. That's pretty complete. It's a little bit short. I think there's 1 or 2 books that it falls short, but I think in terms of Old Testament, it's mostly complete. And then Codex Sinaiticus, that's complete. Vaticanus is cleaner than Sinaiticus. What I mean by that is, through the ages, the scribes would find maybe some little spelling errors or something, whatever, and they would put little annotations on the side pages to show, kind of like if you're proofreading a document, you might do that with a red pen for your friend before you turn it into your, maybe you're in college and you're taking a class type thing, and so before you do the final draft, the copy, it's just a draft copy. So anyway, those little annotations are all through Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Vaticanus is very clean. There's not much of that at all. So despite the fact it's 300 and Sinaiticus is dated around 350, 375, something like that, they kind of lean towards Vaticanus as being more reliable. Anyway, let me continue. We then have one in the mid-400s that is called the Codex Alexandrinus. So these are the 3 LXX, or 3 Greek Septuagint Old Testaments that we have. And every one of those, one of them is complete, and the other two are almost complete, like 95% complete or something, if not 98, something really high, almost complete. Let me continue. However, Sinaiticus, as I understand it, is complete Old Testament, but a lot of corrections all through it, annotations, as I said. In contrast, Vaticanus is almost complete, but it's a little bit earlier than Sinaiticus, but most importantly, the pages are clean, hardly any corrections by scribes. As for Alexandrinus, I don't recall which one it generally agrees with, because Alexandrinus either kind of tends to agree more with Sinaiticus or Vaticanus. I don't remember which one exactly, but obviously it would depend, by book and the Old Testament and stuff. And so, of course, all these that we're talking about with this Greek Septuagint, they all had these so-called 7 extra books that were classified around 400 as apocrypha and stuff or whatever. But we'll get into that in other videos and stuff. But they had all these in them. Let's see. Let me continue. Okay. I read that already. In contrast, the oldest complete Old Testament we have in Hebrew is the Codex Leningrad and the Aleppo Codex. Both of those are dated 1000 something. I think one of them is 1008, but basically 11th century, because the 1000 is 11th century. These are a Masoretic family, of course. Now we do have some good, fragments or chunks of text. This family of Hebrew is, if you've ever heard the term Masoretic text, I'm not going to go into that here, but versus the Septuagint text family, the Masoretic text is believed by some, and I agree with them. When we look at the early church says or whatever, how they're quoting the scriptures, Old Testament versus New Testament, that the Masoretic text actually derives from a different Old Testament family in Hebrew than the Greek Septuagint, that we no longer have those Hebrew copies, although we do have some that match in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not a whole lot. But anyway, that family of texts that the Greek Septuagint was translated from 280 years before Christ came, 280 BC. We don't have that family anymore, and so towards the end of the 1st century, it's believed by many, and there's some evidence towards this, since we see evidence in the 2nd century of discussions with early Christians talking about the Jews changing the scriptures. Many Old Testament prophecies about Christ in their Masoretic text don't read the way that it reads in the Greek Septuagint at that period of time, around 150, 140, 130. Some things like that, and even later on in the other centuries, those kind of discussions. So it's believed with other evidence, I think, that somewhere in the late 1st century, there were some events that happened. There's the controversy of whether this really happened or not. The Council of Jamnia around 90 AD. Of course, Jerusalem was destroyed, as Jesus said it would be, and Daniel prophesied around 70 AD. The Romans came in and just leveled the city. It was a mess. And Josephus talks about that in detail in his writings around that time frame, 70 AD, 70, 80, something like that. But anyway, this Council of Jamnia, they believe that that the Jews just said, enough is enough. This Jesus guy, this resurrection, heresy, all this garbage. Let's get rid of these Greek, unclean Gentile scriptures, and let's just go with the Hebrew. And then a lot of the scribes, whatever, I don't know who knew this or whatever, but they started to see some variations where they didn't match up with the Greek Septuagint writings and stuff. And of course, our New Testament quotes a lot of the Old Testament, and you'll see, if you look into it, if you're not aware, it matches up 90% of the time with the Greek Septuagint. About 50% of the time it matches up with the Jewish Bible, the Masoretic text, which I said is in the King James. So if you have a King James Bible, just start doing an exhaustive, find of Old Testament prophecies in the New Testament. In the Gospels, there's a ton of them in the book of Hebrews. They're all over the New Testament. There's a lot of them in Hebrews. And just go back to your Old Testament in the King James. Some passages in the King James, but I don't think more than a handful. They grabbed from the Greek Septuagint, like Isaiah 7:14 is one. There's a couple others, because they're really important Christian. Psalms 22, they pierced my hand and my feet. Isaiah 7:14 was the virgin will conceive. The Jews changed it apparently, and I believe they did. The Jews changed it to a young woman would conceive. Kind of thing or whatever. And we see that controversy in this writing from Justin Martyr called Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, chapter 70, 71, 72, if you want to Google that, look into that. him talking about. So he's a Christian that died as a martyr. He was discussing this with some Jews around 150. So anyway, let me continue. So it says we do have some good chunks, and I was writing this, good chunks of our Old Testament in the Masoretic text, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we don't have a complete Bible, not even close. So the complete Bibles that we have are these 11th century Hebrew manuscripts and stuff. So anyway, I'll just stop there. That's a bit I would share. Yeah, just the early church, when they're quoting the Old Testament, it matches up with the Septuagint. You know, it's a 10-volume set. It's probably 2-3 feet wide. I don't really have the full set myself. I usually use online resources, and I got a lot of the 2nd century writings in print myself, but they aren't part of the official Ante-Nicene Father volume set. They were published by others and stuff. So, but anyway, yeah, that big volume set. I've heard one textual scholar, Dr. Daniel Wallace, say there's over 1 million quotes from the Bible in the 10-volume set of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And as far as Old Testament goes, I mean, most of the time, if not all the time. I mean, I've never done an exhaustive search, but from what I've seen and what I've heard, talking to others, like David Berceau, for instance, you know, he's a church historian. I mean, that's what we see. I mean, most people I know that knows the early church, it matches up with the Septuagint. That's just the way it is. So anyway, I'll share that with you. All right, God bless.